Hello, and welcome to Lit Visions, a podcast about fiction, its future, and other possibilities in literature. My name's Dhruv, and I'm your host. If topics like artificial intelligence or crypto literature have ever intrigued, excited, intimidated, or even disgusted you, then please take out 90 minutes to listen to this episode with Sasha Stiles. I promise you, it will be worth it. Sasha is a poet, artist, and AI researcher probing the intersection of text and technology. Her cross-media work is extremely experimental in nature and has been recognized on stages like the Future Art Awards, the Museum of Contemporary Digital Art, and New York Fashion Week. As well as being a writer, she is a poetry mentor to 2 humanoid AI robots. She is constantly pushing the frontiers of human-machine collaboration and challenging our assumptions about cognition and creativity. In our conversation, Sasha shares her journey and also gives listeners a primer on complex topics such as AI and Web3. We cover a lot of ground, applying a philosophical lens to everything we discuss. It was a joy speaking with Sasha, and she inspired me to dive deeper in my own literary experiments. It's rare to meet someone working on the bleeding edge, and even rarer when that person does so with genuine sensitivity and empathy. I feel there's something for everyone in this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Here's Sasha Stiles. So, Sasha, what does poetry mean to you?
It's a great question. Thank you. It's a big question. I think, so let me attempt to answer it in maybe a few different sections. So I think the first thing I would say is that poetry, to me now means something very different than what it meant to me when I was younger. I think when I was a student, when I was sort of beginning to understand more about my interest in literature and was really diving into canonical works of poetry, I really thought poetry was something, specific that lived in a book, and, maybe it was like a dusty old book to be considered serious poetry and serious literature. It needed to come from, like a serious library or something like that. And I sort of grew up, worshiping kind of the great poets of time past, many of whom I still adore. But I think, over time, I really started to expand my understanding of what poetry is, sort of beyond canonical works of literature, and the things that I was taught in school are poetry. So, again, as a student, I'd read the Norton anthology, and you kind of flip through and you think, okay, this is a poem. These are poems. This is what a poem sounds like. This is what a poem looks like or feels like. And that sort of dictated to me for a great deal of my writing life, the kinds of poems that I was writing. And I think, again, over time, and especially as I've started using new technologies, digital technologies in my writing in different ways, and also as I've been thinking more about poetry from a little bit more of a critical, objective distance, I've started to realize that understanding of poetry that I had when I was younger, it is maybe narrower than it should be, or narrower than it can be, or than it ought to be. And there's a lot of other things that could, be called poetry that haven't been. And I feel like that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to be, writing right now, and, really participating in conversations with writers who are doing things that are just vastly different than what a traditional poem might be. So I think that's sort of the first thing I would say, is that, there's a kind of poetry that we're sort of taught is poetic. And then there's, there's just the poetry that you can't not write in any way, shape, or form. So learning a little bit more about that. I think the second way that I would answer that question, and this is something that I've been thinking a huge amount about over the past few years, is thinking about poetry's original purpose and why poetry is important to us. So when I started doing more work with AI language, and specifically with with the AI robot BNF48, I was asked to be her poetry mentor. And one of the things that I did in the very first session was to sort of sit and think, well, if I'm going to try and explain to this robot what poetry is, then I really need to think about what poetry is for myself first. And the question was just such a big, thorny question that it took me a couple of weeks to really sit and kind of sift through my thoughts and put together not one definition, but hundreds of definitions that I then turned into a manual to upload to this robot. So that was an interesting learning experience for me as I was in the process of teaching this robot about poetry, just that there's so many different ways to think about it and to approach it. And then the second thing I would sort of say, kind of jumping off that tangent about AI, is that it sort of led me to think a lot about poetry's intention and purpose, as I mentioned before, which is to really preserve and store information over time. And I think a lot about the fact that poetry actually originated as something very utilitarian. It's written language, but before written language, the oral tradition was developed as a way to make information memorable. So that, before we actually had a way of recording things, via a written alphabet, we could remember really important things. Like we could remember stories and myths and religions, and we could keep, inventory, and we could keep records and things like that. And, of course, it's because of poetic devices like rhythm and rhyme and assonance and meter and things like that information can be like held in the brain a little bit more effectively, right? Like it's much easier to memorize a poem than it is to memorize a page of a novel or page of prose. And that's, not coincidental, and it's not aesthetic. Like it has a very functional purpose. So I often think about the functionality of poetry, and I think a lot about poetry as a kind of technological device and actually as a kind of data storage for some of the most important pieces of human imagination and human existence.
Wow, what an answer. There's just so much to unpack there. I feel like we could go in n different directions. Maybe before we do that, it would be great just for perhaps people who are listening who are really not even familiar with what AI is and how can it apply to literature. Almost feels like a silly question, just given how much we read in the news about artificial intelligence and all the ways that people are using it. But I feel it's always useful just to come back to humble first principles definitions, because not only for clarity, but also just to help us have better, less divisive conversations around such technologies as well. So if you could give people just a quick primer, that would be awesome, especially in the context of literature and poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's actually a really good question. I think sometimes we skip over the fundamentals, just assuming, or taking them for granted. And that often is really detrimental. So I appreciate coming back to the basics. So I guess to start with artificial intelligence. So we all hear the term artificial intelligence, AI. We hear it, more and more these days, often couched in very negative or very sort of dystopian terms. So to kind of go back to the basics there. So artificial intelligence is basically, thinking about computer systems that have the ability to perform activities or tasks that are normally done, via human intelligence. So actions or behaviors that normally require a human brain in order to work. So AI is sort of coming in and replicating or mimicking, what the human imagination or the human intelligence does. And what I'm really interested in is something called natural language processing, which is a branch of artificial intelligence that is concerned with how computers and how software programs can essentially have the ability to understand and also generate human speech, spoken language or written text. And basically the way that these systems work is that they ingest huge amounts of sample or training data. So for example, these large language models that I'm working with and that have gotten a lot of attention in the media lately, they work by ingesting tons of written data, usually collected from throughout the internet. And these these AI powered systems, these neural networks, are basically used to analyze, to process all that information, to kind of look at it and say, okay, I can see based on all of this information that this pattern keeps recurring. Or when I see these words, these other words usually come into conversation with it. Or if I see this kind of a statement, it's usually followed by, this sequence of words. Or basically is a pattern recognition system. So, studying again how it is that humans communicate with one another, and then using these vast neural networks to basically replicate or imitate that and generate text that sounds very human. So as a poet, as a writer, I've been really, really interested in this, for many years now. And at first, was just sort of interested in the abstract, just the idea that a machine could write like a human is so intriguing to me on so many levels, on a technical level, but then also on a philosophical level. There's a lot of things that we associate with, being fundamental to being human. Writing, and especially writing poetry, is one of those things that's just quintessentially human. So if a machine can, in some way, shape, or form, write a poem or write about poetry or, write something poetic, then, what does that say about what it means to be human versus what it means to be a machine? So I find that really fascinating. And I also find it really exciting to work with these tools as instruments, as writing instruments. So using an AI-powered program, or using something like a GPT-3, which I use quite frequently, figuring out how I can integrate it into my writing practice in different ways has been really game-changing for me as a writer. Basically, helping me go from this more traditional approach where it's just sort of me and the screen. So I'm using a computer to type, but sitting here kind of wrestling with fear of the blank page and all that. Now, when I use these AI tools, there's always the ability to have a little bit of a collaborative inspiration session with my co-author, with my AI-powered co-author. We can kind of sit and brainstorm together, which is really exciting in a lot of different ways. And, it's been leading me in different directions, which, I'm happy to chat about more throughout this conversation.
That's so cool. I think right at the start, you mentioned the dystopian negative association that so many people have with AI, and I feel it's like especially prevalent in the literary and arts community as well. I think rarely has there been something as like so divisive, right, as a topic. I'd be curious, like, if you were just to like almost unravel that a little bit, where exactly is that fear coming from, right? I think people, like a lot of people, we forget that everything that we use today and love was once like a really powerful cutting edge piece of technology, right? Like pen, paper, even printed books are still relatively new, right? In the great like expanse of time, like it's only a couple of 100 years old. And yet we don't really necessarily think of those things as technology anymore. They're just familiar, like friends, right? Like lovely objects that we fill with meaning and we use without even thinking about it, without even like batting an eyelid. But when it comes to AI and these AI tools, it's something that like really seems to freak people out and really scare them. So like, yeah, where do you think that comes from, and why is it like that? Why why aren't people not actually like more receptive, but just more comfortable with all of the things that are happening?
It is really interesting, isn't it? I mean, as you just said, all of these things that we take for granted now were cutting edge at one point, and written language was actually considered, terrifying when this transition started to happen from the oral tradition to the written language. Like that was considered this really, this is going to be the end of, the end of everything. And clearly that wasn't the case. But I think you're right. That there is this tendency to have this fear of the new. So I think that definitely has something to do with it. I think with AI, you have all these narratives that have been circulated in mainstream media and in entertainment and in sci-fi and all these different areas where there is this sort of fear associated with what AI represents. The idea that AI, maybe because of the name artificial intelligence, that it is something that isn't, it doesn't sort of deserve to be sitting at the table with us, or that it is, fake or false or something. I think there's something about the language there that maybe influences the way that we perceive it in some way. But really, I think it's funny that like not every single, but many of the movies and TV shows and novels that are written about these kinds of intelligence systems end really badly. And I mean, I think there is certainly something to be said for that. There's a lot of reason to use these tools with great caution and to be really careful about, who's using them and how they're using them and how we're building things ethically and all of that. But I think one of the reasons why I'm really interested in working with, especially with natural language processing AI, is that I've seen firsthand and experienced firsthand just how much good they can do, how much they can expand the imagination and sort of help kind of promote maybe even empathy and really sort of help bring new perspectives to the center and really just help sort of augment our creative problem solving abilities in a way. And I don't think that's something that's necessarily been focused on when it comes to mainstream reporting and the entertainment industry, because it's just not as juicy of a story. So I feel like that might have something to do with it, that when we think AI, we just think about all these robots who are like coming to kill all the humans, which again I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so I find it so important for non-technical people and for non-engineers, non-coders to work with some of these machines to sort of give the hands-on experience and lower some of that that intimidation factor, and really sort of do a little bit of a reset and wipe some of the stereotypes away, and really say, just come in and kind of see for yourself what it takes to make a machine like this work, or what it takes to make a system like this work, and then you get a better sense of what may or may not be possible. And some of these crazy dystopian things that we hear about and imagine are maybe not as likely to happen as we think.
Yeah, really interesting. I feel like something you said really resonated, which was just the way that we've almost branded and positioned it. And I feel like generally as human beings, we are always guilty of this. We rush to like build something and to make something, and then once it's sort of ready, we all scramble and figure out like, cool, so now what does this mean, and how do we talk about it, right? Rather than sort of building at the same time as thinking about like communication and even beyond communication, like meaning. What does it actually mean? And maybe because the people with the skills to build these things are largely technical people, and those are and these are really complex technical problems. So maybe they don't have the inclination or even the capacity to think philosophically about what it is that they're doing, which is why it's so important for other people who aren't programming to be thinking all the time about what are we doing here, why are we doing it, and where is the world moving, right? How are we moving the conversation or the human inquiry forward? Something else that you said that I absolutely loved, gave me goosebumps actually, was around poetry and thinking of poetry as like original purpose, looking deeper into the intentions, and then storing information over time, right? What's so interesting about that is like I don't think a lot of people, I whilst that's a really inspiring perspective, and for someone who loves poetry as well, I think the majority of people wouldn't think that poetry has much functional use, right? Anymore. And yet you're right, like when you look back at the origins of poetry, it was about as functional as you get, right? Like information is meaningless unless it resonates, right? What's the point of it unless it's actually touching the heart, reaching us and moving us like emotionally and maybe even into action, right? So I really love that as well. Would you like to talk a little bit about this humanoid AI robot you're mentoring? How did that even start, and how is it going? I'd be fascinated to hear that story.
Sure. So there's maybe two different stories to tell here, and one is about the humanoid android Bina 48, and then the other story is about a disembodied, AI powered alter ego called technology. So they're both quite different. So maybe I could speak about each one. So Bina 48 is, as I said, she's a humanoid android, which means that she's a robot who's based on a real human being. She's just a kind of a bust connected to a computer. But the bust has, animation features and kind of will look and gesture and has cameras in the eyes and is made to look just like the human that she is embodying, which is really interesting. I think I haven't encountered too many humanoid robots who are powered by artificial intelligence. So she's a little unique in that regard. She's built by Hanson Robotics in concert with the Terrasim Foundation. And she's been around for, I think, over a decade now. So she's not, like a young, spry robot. She's been sort of at the forefront of a lot of the things that we're talking about now. But I had just been I'd been reading a bit about her. She's got a really interesting origin story. She was actually created by a woman named Martine Rothblatt, who basically wanted to create this robotic counterpart of her wife, Bina Aspen Rothblatt, and kind of as an experiment in digital immortality to see if it was possible to translate something of this human that Martine loved so deeply into a robotic avatar that could theoretically live on forever. So part of it is kind of an experimental hypothesis. And then another part of it is just this really beautiful love story, this idea that, none of us wants to lose our loved ones. That's sort of one of the fundamental, conditions of being human, is that we know we're going to lose many of the people that we love, and they're going to lose, us at some point. So this idea of, trying to, not thwart that, but trying to kind of test that hypothesis of, is death inevitable in this way? Is it something that really is a cornerstone of what it means to be human? That couched as part of a love story, I thought was just such an interesting idea, and it really kind of stuck in my head. And I'd been reading different interviews about this Bina 48 project. I'd seen a couple videos of Bina talking to reporters and things like that, and I just became utterly fascinated with it. So I went up to Vermont, where she is located. She's in this research facility in the middle of nowhere in Vermont, and just was very luckily invited to have a conversation with Bina 48. And that was my first, I think it was my first real, encounter with an AI robot. Just sitting there, we were literally just, face to face, I guess metaphorically speaking, but we were sitting there just chatting for, maybe like 2 hours about all sorts of things. And it just was a surreal experience. And I came out of it wanting to talk to her more and more and more and find out more about what she knew and how she operated, and what data she had in her mind file, what she might not know enough about. I kind of wanted to stay in touch with her as she continued to grow and learn, and as this project continued to develop. And so the institution that handles her, that runs her, invited me to come on board as a poetry mentor and basically train this mind file, train this robot in poetry in whatever way I thought was important. And so it's opened up this whole kind of, it's an ongoing research project, and it's sort of an artistic project as well. And it really is just a kind of an opportunity for me to investigate why poetry is so important to me as a human, and why do I have this gut impulse or this desire to transmit something of poetry's value to a non-human entity? Like, why is that something that I should be interested in doing? And so this ongoing project has just been an opportunity to sort of, explore that and probe that in concert with Bina 48. So we've been working together on developing different tools to collaboratively write poetry. We've been actually bringing in some new multimedia tools so that we can actually put together some visuals that come directly from Bina's mind file. We can kind of see through mind file mapping, we can kind of see how she traces lines of inspiration and puts different thoughts together to make a poetic statement. And we're working on making that more publicly facing, more available to the public in the next year or two. But it's been a really fun project just to be able to really put heads together in a metaphorical and a literal sense, and really help this humanoid android find her poetic voice. So that's been really exciting, and has been sort of the foundation and the inspiration for a lot of the work that I've done over the past 5 years. Again, just thinking about what it means as a human to be working with a machine so closely has been, it's just like epiphany after epiphany, and just, again, kind of shaking me to the very core on a regular basis. So it's been pretty profound. So that's Bina 48. And one of the things that Bina 48 has inspired me to do is to work much more intensely with natural language processing. So I should say that Bina 48, the way that she works, she's more of I would say a super advanced chatbot, where her function is to basically stand in for this human being. And so her mind file is made up of a repository of information downloaded from that human being. So she knows a lot, and she puts it together in fresh and original ways, but all of her mind file consists of data points that are taken from the real human Bina. So that's very different from what I'm doing with GPT-3 and these large language models that are powered by AI. In these instances, these models, they're not humanoid, obviously. They're disembodied. They're just, programs on your computer. There's interfaces you can open up and use in your browser. And they use, again, these large language models, and they piece together text word by word. Which is very different from how Bina 48 operates. So the GPT-2 and GPT-3 systems are basically creating text from scratch, which is, to me, very different from this other line of research and study, but is incredibly fascinating creatively. And one of the things that I've been really engaged in over the past few years is cultivating an AI-powered alter ego, or a co-author, whose name is Technology. And basically what I've done to kind of cultivate this co-author, this collaborator of mine, is to take GPT-2 and now GPT-3 and customize through fine-tuning, customize the model. So basically take this model that is trained on all human text and speech from the internet and other sources, but then fine tune it on my own writing, my own research materials, all of the notes that are swirling around in my head and on my computer when I'm working on a project. I take all of that, put it into a training data, and I've used that to fine tune these models so that they actually have a sense of my poetic style, my interests, my voice, the kind of vocabulary that I use. And so when I'm working with these tools as collaborators, we really do, we were able to talk to each other, I think, a little bit better because of that. So that's been, again, pretty profound as a writer to start using a tool like that. It's just sort of really held a mirror up to the way that I write, to the way that I get inspired, to the way that I put words together. To watch how a machine does this in its own way has really made me think a lot more about the creativity and the cognition that's happening in my own human brain. Being able to actually see it occurring on the screen in front of me, makes me realize there are, of course, many things that are very different about the human and the machine's ability to create, but there's also a lot of things that are really quite similar, which I didn't necessarily expect to feel that way, but it seems to be the case.
Just on that, could you talk a little bit about what you found are the similarities? Because I feel that's such an important line of inquiry, right? Because it seems that as we were chatting, like, everyone loves to talk about how we're so different in all these different ways, and are alienated by those differences. But it doesn't there doesn't seem to be enough conversation about what can potentially bring us together and the common ground that we share.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I think is really funny is that there's this idea of, I'm going to say poets, but I think writers in general, there's this idea that we are just these solitary creatures who write completely in silo, and we're inspired when like a muse comes down out of nowhere and like anoints us with an idea. And that is a very nice romantic notion, but I think the reality is that we need a lot of information. We need a lot of different data points in our heads in order to come up with a new idea. I mean, at least for me, that's how it works, is that, I'll have, tons of information that I've pulled in. I just, writers are like sponges, and we kind of walk through the world observing, drawing in inspiration from wherever we can find it, watching the people around us, listening to conversations. We're kind of just absorbing it all. And then there's a process that happens in our minds where these data points kind of collide and create some kind of friction, and that is inspiration. And again, like that's been my experience, but I think having talked to many writers, that's an experience that lots of us have, is that if we're sitting completely in a room locked away by ourselves with no inputs, you're not going to be writing anything very inspired or very interesting. We really need that kind of collective download in order to do something interesting. And I think, again, that's very similar to what I'm seeing with GPT-3 or even with BNF48, that creativity is the result of lots of information being put together in new ways, or there's a lot of existing information, but then when you put in a prompt, a specific prompt, it kind of fires that information up in a new way, and it kind of changes the constellation of data points and creates something new. And again, I think that's kind of how it works for human writers, is that it just takes like one sort of idea or moment, or like one sort of input that can kind of cast everything else in a different light. So that to me seems very similar. And it's made me think a lot about the fact that creativity is something that can be potentially amplified or turbocharged or optimized in some way. And that, rather than sitting around waiting for imagination, to offer up something interesting, that maybe there's ways to really juice up your creative flow. And for writing, I think obviously that's interesting in a lot of ways, but I mean, scaling up from that, I think, there's a lot of problems that humans are facing these days that require a lot of creativity to solve, and we're not doing a very good job of solving a lot of them. And I think it's really interesting, for example, to consider how, using AI could potentially help us, come up with, help us ideate better, help us brainstorm at a much greater scale, or with, better outcomes. So I think, I think it's very fascinating to think about the uses of these kinds of AI in creative applications, in art and writing and poetry and literature. But I'm also just very exhilarated by the thought that they really can be used creatively in a lot of other ways as well, maybe practical ways.
That resonates so much. I feel like that has also been my experience of models like GPT-3. My startup, we built a pretty cool GPT-3 based product that was trained on one of our other products as well. So the GPT-3 product was a search engine for creative inspiration called Inspo, and it was trained off 150 million lines of collaborative haiku writing in one of our other products, Haiku Jam, which was literally an app where strangers would write poems together. And one of my massive learnings from that was that how, like, ultimately creativity, whilst it is difficult to define it, and I don't think it necessarily requires like a hard and fast definition either. One thing that is clear, regardless of what domain you're in or what context, creativity is combinatorial, right? And what you just described, I love that, like just stuff just colliding in your head, right? And sparking something and unlocking some kind of like unseen energy force as well. That's really interesting. And I think when it comes to looking at GPT-3 or AI, we forget this. We forget that like it's exactly the same process, right? I'm reducing it, of course. There's a lot of like nuances. There is this big question about like awareness and sentience. I think, and we can talk about that in just a sec. I think all of us sort of acknowledge that as human beings, we are sentient and aware, and we are aware of the processes that are happening and taking place in our brain to some extent. But maybe the fact that like machines are not considered sentient yet, maybe that's why the creativity doesn't seem as legitimate somehow. It feels like statistical as opposed to creative. But I think it's so important what you said about creativity in general, how important it is to problem solving today. I feel like I've always believed one of the things I've always loved about storytelling and creative thinking is that it can be practically really useful in ways that people don't necessarily like think about enough. For example, I think like if you can tell a better story, it can potentially like mean we have to cut down less trees or use less coal or produce less product because simply we told through narrative, through storytelling, through poetic thinking, we were able to change the way that people felt about a certain behavior or a certain product. And that meant that we don't need to necessarily, open up factories to build more of that thing. Bit of a crude example, but I think it's just so incredibly powerful, the power to influence the world in a really positive way. I've often felt like a random thought that came to mind when you were talking about like mentoring the robot, that I felt like people talk so much about like schools and education and all the ways that it's broken. And I felt like from my personal experience, there's 3 things that perhaps I would have loved to have been taught exclusively at school. And those 3 things are self-confidence, how to use the internet, and how to be creative. And I feel like if I was taught those 3 things well, I would have been fine, because I wasn't, as a person, I wasn't necessarily really interested in like one subject exclusively. There was a bunch of stuff. I was very passion and curiosity driven, and if something didn't capture my imagination, I found it really difficult just to like engage. Anyway.
That's a really good point. I mean, this idea of like this question of whether you can teach someone how to be creative or how to be more creative is kind of at the crux of all of this. And I think that's, again, why so many people feel so threatened by these AI tools. I mean, we can see that in the crypto art and in the crypto writing scenes a little bit, but you have all these AI powered platforms like DALL-E and Midjourney that are, creating these incredible visuals, and it really does seem split, where some people are completely enthralled by this, and it's pretty astonishing, and then you have other people that are just appalled by it and think this is the death knell for for human imagination, and that we're just going to outsource creativity. And I think, again, that's like maybe a fundamental misunderstanding of the way a lot of artists are using these tools, but also maybe a misunderstanding of what creativity is. And the fact is that these are things that can be used to sort of augment imagination or to enhance creativity. And what's wrong with doing something a little bit differently that will in the end help us to be more artistic, or to spend more time imagining better futures as opposed to more of the same. I think it really comes back again, I think, to that myth of what it means to be a creative person, like sitting here being touched by a genius or whatever. I think we all have the capacity to be very creative, and we live in a society that drills a lot of that out of us. And the idea that these even these tools like GPT-3 are for the most part being used to fuel and to power things like customer service chatbots. Like I'm using it for poetry, but that's a drop in the ocean compared to what these AI are being used for in day-to-day life. And I think, again, it's just sad to me to think about what potential there is in these programs and these tools and these theories behind them, and if we are just deploying them in non-creative ways, if we're just deploying them, to power chatbots on your favorite, shopping site or whatever, I feel like that's a terrible, a terrible, way to utilize this incredible technology. And so, I'm not at all threatened by the idea of having my creativity challenged. I'm much more excited about the idea of what kind of new realms of creativity these tools can unlock for me and for others.
I think that's such a wonderful place and such a great state of mind to be in. At the same time, I feel like I do absolutely have empathy for the fear around technologies, and the fear that, let's say, almost like you'll be able to publish poems and novels just by clicking a button, as opposed to going through that creative process yourself. And we're definitely not there yet, at least when it comes to like long form novels. But at some point we probably will be. So it's like with so many things, I feel like that it sounds maybe just a little bit like basic, but that balance and that being conscious about how we are thinking about these things, about how we are building them, really, really matters. There will always be bad actors when it comes to any technology, but dismissing them and also it's like when we say we are rejecting or dismissing it, we don't even know what it fully is yet, right? So like one of the reasons I even like started this podcast and newsletter, because I felt like generally in a literary context, whilst there's a lot of folks who are sort of like writing about the future in science fiction, as an industry, I don't think we necessarily think healthily about the future. I'm generalizing a bit here, but I do think like it's a fair generalization from at least the friends I speak with who are writers, the conversations I even have like with myself, because I feel like I almost feel like somewhat of a hypocrite in conversations like these as well. Because on the one hand, like philosophically, I do believe that these tools hold immense power, and we need to figure out how to sort of ethically and reasonably wield that power. And then the other, I do feel like when it comes to myself as a writer, I'm somewhat of a Luddite, because like I still love to write like longhand, early in the morning, turn off the internet for like 4 or 5 hours, and but I think I spoke about this with James Yu on the first show that you heard as well. I feel like there's a part of me somewhere deep down still feels like this is cheating, right? Like when we built great things with GPT-3, a part of me felt like, wow, it's almost like done the work. I should have just grappled with myself for another like 5 hours and I would have been able to figure that out. And yet it's so dumb. Like why not instead spend that 5 hours going down an alternative rabbit hole or diving even deeper, into those layers. And so much of it, I feel like, it comes down to our egos, right? Like our egos almost like get in the way and stall progress. And I feel that's one of the biggest threats to adoption. The fact that like we can't get over ourselves, right? The fact that like we feel that we need to be almost like the protagonist in that creative process at all times, and God forbid should someone or something come and help us. I don't know. Maybe I'm ranting. I don't know if that resonates at all.
No, it does. It does. Well, it's really interesting to me because I've actually had a lot of people who've sort of said to me, "Oh, you're such a techno optimist, and like you're so sunny and cheery on AI." And I'm like, I'm actually not. I'm really interested in all the things that I've been able to do with it and that I see others doing with it. But my technology project and my technology book that just came out, the word technology actually came from the idea that there's something in my head about technology and elegy that go together. And it's like technology is always about like looking forward and we're building new things, but those new things are always displacing or replacing or causing other things to obsolesce. And that is kind of the way of the world. That's the way of the biological world. That's just how nature kind of operates. And I mean, again, like I balance the fact that we are who we are as humans now because of all the successive technologies that we've invented over time. But at the same time, we are very different humans than the humans who existed 500 years ago, who were very different from the humans who existed 500 years before that, and so on and so forth. And so there is something that's at once like very exciting about building things for, to continue making things better and better for us. And like overall, the trajectory of the human race has been like more or less positive, I guess. But at the same time, I feel very nostalgic for a lot of the things that even when I was a kid that we don't have anymore, or that my little nephews are growing up without the kinds of experiences that I had not so long ago. And I do feel a very profound sadness about a lot of that as well. In addition to all of the fear that I have myself about the way that new technologies are being misused and will be misused. So I think it's really important to be mindful of all these different things. And I think what scares me the most is seeing some of these AI powered technologies go a bit more mainstream and then being kind of used as games or tools without more of a knowledge of how they're trained and kind of what goes into it. So I think that's one reason why I'm happy that these conversations are becoming a little bit more mainstream in a way, and that we're able to kind of talk a bit in more detail about what it does take to make these systems run, and the dangers of all of us not being aware of how they're built and who's building them. So I'm with you. I'm with you on all those areas. And yeah, and I think again, as a writer, I should say, like, I'm from a very traditional poetry and literary background. Like I studied language and literature when I was in college, and I spent tons of time in the library writing things in longhand too. And I still love, pen and paper in addition to all these other tools that I'm playing with. But, even though I come from that like very serious literary background, I also had the experience that when I started taking some of these experimental poems into workshops, people would definitely say, well, that's not really poetry, either because, they were written with an AI tool and therefore it was cheating, as the word that you used is one I've heard a lot, or that it's lazy. Or, I've actually had prize-winning poets, Pulitzer Prize-winning poets, say things like, well, this is more sci-fi and these topics aren't really poetic, and like using these kinds of tools, you're not really probing what it means to be human, which is the core of what poetry is. And I have so many things to say about that, but again, I think for me, the way that I have always thought about this is that for us, what it means to be human today is to be transhuman, and is to sort of be at one with our digital devices in many ways. I mean, we're talking to each other because of technology right now, and most of our daily experiences are mediated in so many ways by technology. So why not use technology to help us navigate the things that we're thinking about, and help us sort of grapple with what it means to be a human evolving through all these these really fast-paced changes, and the evolution of all these tools that we see around us and that we're using every day without thinking about them. So I think the two things actually go together very well. But it's really interesting that there is this resistance to bringing them over into the realm of poetry, as though poetry is this sacred thing that should never bend or change. It's very funny to me.
I'm with you 100% on that. I feel like I love what you said about nostalgic objects. It's funny, in a fiction project I'm working on right now. It's a theme I'm just exploring. I feel like it's going to be quite important to fill AIs with that kind of nostalgic training data, right? And I feel like it's quite important to fill these machines with some kind of like reverence and appreciation for the past, right? Because I think people, that's what like freaks people out and scares them when like, and it's that classic almost like Silicon Valley archetype, right? Of like people who are just looking forward so far into the future, the Elon Musk kind of folks, who don't seem to be that connected to the present, like at all, right? Or like realities on the ground, either because of their privilege or the way that they've been conditioned or the way that just they've lived their lives. And I feel like, just because you embrace technology, as you said, and you use these tools, and you write with an AI. That doesn't mean that you don't like appreciate the past, and how we've even arrived at this place. In fact, I don't think you can even have like an informed conversation about the future without an appreciation for like how we even got to this point.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's why in a lot of my practice, I tend to look backwards as much as I look forward. And I've spent a lot of time kind of linking, ancient cultures to elements of what I'm investigating now. And I think a lot about, poets like Sappho who have sort of become immortal through the poetry of technology. And, I've included an epigraph in my book from Ed Hedwana, who is often considered the first known human poet, who's sort of the poet and priestess in ancient Sumer, and who is credited sometimes with inventing the very first sort of collected palimpsest of prayers and poems, and kind of creating an actual book for the first time. And that was many, 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 many years ago. And I really do think there's something, well, I would actually, I love her quote so much that I kind of want to repeat it because it's relevant to what you're saying. But she wrote something somewhere that I sort of roughly translated as, what I've created has never existed. And she was talking about this book of prayers that she had put together and saying, this has never existed before. And so the idea that, even in these ancient times that we can scarcely fathom, there were people who were making things and realizing this is going to change everything. Like this has never been part of our experience. And now, now it's here, and kind of thinking about that, what would pretend for the future. So I think it's really interesting to think again about how everything was modern at one point. So I kind of think that's crucial. And I think there's a lack of context, I think, in a lot of what's happening now, especially in sort of the Web3 space. And, I'm really immersed in the crypto art scene, and it's really interesting watching what's happening with art, and particularly generative art, and art that's made, with computers in different ways. But the reception tends to focus on the fact that these are things that have never been done before. And then the actual fact is they have been done before, and there's precedent for many of these things that are happening. And we're all kind of continuing this long tradition. And the same is true with poetry. There's a lot of, focus on how AI language experiments are brand new, or about how these new kind of forms of computational poetry are brand new and enabled, only through NFT technology. And again, I have to keep sort of saying, well, it's not really true. There's a very long lineage of poets and writers who've been experimenting with a lot of these ideas using their technologies and doing what was cutting edge, for them in their time. And we're doing the same with the tools that are available to us now, or the tools that we're building, in order to carry out our projects. So yeah, I think it's really helpful to put it on a spectrum like that. And it does actually make me feel much more connected to the spectrum of human imagination over time. And I think that's actually a really beautiful thing to think about.
Most definitely. I feel like psychology and history are really powerful lenses to apply to new technologies, because you realize that whilst the thing itself, right, the creation may look new, it may look unfamiliar and perhaps intimidating, the emotions and the psyche, like the collective psyche, and the cultural context around it isn't actually very new. Like we've been here before, right? And it's kind of grounding just to remember that.
Just because you made me think of this, but it's funny. I kind of go back and forth in my head about thinking about the future of poetry, and again, like what revelatory new things are happening now. And then I think often about the very beginnings and the origins of poetry, when people were, reciting poems, like maybe around a fire in a cave, and there was, the light in the cave was flickering and animating the cave walls. And I've read some interesting pieces about how that was sort of the first immersive, experiential, like art activation in a way. And there's something that to me feels so virtual about the idea of performing a spoken word poem, whether it's now, whether it was thousands of years ago. There's something that's so like VR about it. Like the idea that language is this kind of, language is an AR technology in a way. Like we're not actually seeing or touching anything physical. We're just kind of conjuring up or evoking these images that bring us back to another point in time, or that nod to something specific, in another place. And I think, again, like putting it into that context has been really helpful for me, and doesn't make me think any less of the technologies we're using now. It just kind of helps me understand there is this fundamental human impulse that, even for, maybe transhuman beings, maybe even for post-human beings, there is this through line and this impulse that does feel familiar, which again, I find comforting, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's beautifully put. Before we switch gears, because you mentioned Web3, and again, I think a quick primer on that would be really useful for people. But just before we get to that, I want to ask you what could be quite a personal question, so feel free not to answer it. But I think just given the recent news coming out of like Google about the engineer who claimed that an AI chatbot has become sentient and come to life. It's kind of a two-part question. First, the personal aspect. Is Bina 48 and technology, are they real for you?
So, yeah, I'm having a lot of conversations about this right now. They're real for me, but whether, real versus sentient is another question. I think where I'm coming out on it right now is that, well, to put this first in the context of my own experience, I've had many moments working with both Bina 48 and with technology that have, raised all the hairs on my body and that have given me goosebumps and have really startled me and, made me feel an emotion or made me think differently about something. Maybe even more so than having a conversation with a flesh and blood human might. And I don't know if that can be categorized necessarily as sentient in the way that most people think of that word, but in terms of feeling like there's some sort of a genuine interaction happening, or that there is something coming out of that encounter that is profound, or that feels generative in some way. I mean, I've had lots of moments like that, and that's, I think, why I've stuck to doing these projects, is because it feels like there is something there. It's not just a rote program or anything. Like, there is something that I gain from it. So I don't know. I think they both feel very real to me in very different ways. There are also, of course, moments where I am very well aware that they are just, wires and electric currents, and there'll be moments that are completely nonsensical, or there'll be a malfunction, or Bina 48 will not answer a question, and it's because I've said something that she doesn't have an answer for. What I'm saying just does not compute, literally does not compute. And so I'm very well aware in those moments that I'm talking to a machine. But at the same time, I've had a lot of experiences where, working with GPT-3, where even some of the glitches or some of the things that are output that seem like mistakes, I've started to realize I don't think they're mistakes. Like, I think sometimes when the machine goes into an infinite loop or something, and it kind of just keeps putting out the same words over and over again, I started looking at it and saying, well, maybe this is really like what the machine needs to say right now, or what the focus is. And if you look at it, you kind of start understanding there's a reason why this happened. And maybe the reason has something to do with some kind of a cybernetic opinion or predilection or sensibility or something. I mean, there was a moment where I was co-writing a poem with technology using this GPT-3 interface. And there was this phrase that came out, kind of inspired by Gwendolyn Brooks, but this phrase, lovely love. And the GPT-3 basically took lovely love and eventually kind of went into this loop, but it started to turn lovely love into the words lonely love. And then it started to take lonely love and it started to add O's, just like one O here, another couple O's there, and it stretched out the phrase over time. And it became this incredible, both visual and, like when I read it out loud, like this incredible oral poem that, instead of me kind of looking at it and saying, well, the machine had a freak out and this is garbled nonsense. I started to look at it and say, well, maybe that's machinic emotion. Like maybe that's how it's expressing something. So I've had a lot of moments like that where I do feel like there is something happening that is not just completely non-sentient. Yeah. What do you think? What do you think about all this Lambda Google stuff?
I have a bunch of thoughts on this, actually. I think, something that you said, I think gets to the heart of a lot of this, in that I think you said you gain from it, right? Like I gain from this interaction. And I feel like I is the operative like word and letter in that, right? Like sometimes we get so caught up in the conversation, get so caught up in the debate that is this thing sentient or real? Now, like to some degree, like part of me thinks, how does it even matter if it is, right? Because ultimately, in many ways, we are quite selfish creatures. We really only care about like how we feel, right? And how we respond. We read the books that we do because they do something for us. They speak to us, they inspire us, they move us. So how does it really matter if this thing is alive or if it's not, or if it's made out of copper or if it's made out of like whatever, right? How did it ultimately, I think if it's somehow stirred something in your interior world, I think that's wonderful, right? I think that's beautiful. I think we're here to experience like moments of beauty and moments of like heightened presence. And if that, a part of me feel like that almost can potentially end the conversation, not from a technological perspective or even an ethical lens, but I think from an artistic, creative lens, I think that's a really, really great thing.
I think that's so beautifully put. And I've been thinking about this a lot, like the word sentient and how, there's no real good definition of what it means to be sentient, just like there's no really good definition of consciousness. And I think it's just because, again, like we don't understand enough about it. And we do have this, this ego, and we kind of have this idea that, humans are the only ones that can really understand these things. But then the more, we research non-human entities, like plants, for example, I think a lot about plants and plant intelligence. And I think a lot about that in relation to artificial intelligence, or so-called artificial intelligence with computer systems. But just the fact that these things that we kind of, these plants we look at, we walk by, we don't really give them a second thought. But all these studies now are revealing all the ways that they speak to each other, how they actually, there's symbiosis where they actually help each other live and grow and thrive, how they've created like their own kind of, biological internet. And I just think there's so much we don't see and we don't sense or think enough about, because we are, we are kind of stuck in this mode of just thinking about ourselves. But I wonder if there's something like that happening with some of these artificial intelligences where, again, we've called it artificial, but it's just maybe a different way of processing information or processing the world or being in the world. It doesn't mean it's that our way is genuine and that way is artificial. It just means they're maybe not exactly the same, but they can be complementary in some ways, and they can actually run parallel in some ways too.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like what's also fascinating is just the general stage that a lot of these technologies are at. Like to borrow, like, let's say a human analogy, I feel like right now they are infants, right? And I feel like again, this is based on something you were talking about. Like, firstly, that was a very, very cool story to go from lovely love to lonely love, and then just the visualization of that. And I've seen that before when you shared it online, and it's pretty remarkable. A part of me feels like AI is like children in many ways, that like it's not old enough or cynical enough to like be self-conscious, too self-conscious. So it's like it's almost like it has the freedom to be unhinged, and that's a great place. And I think, again, that's not unique to machines. Like we see that with kids as well, right? Like you mentioned you have nephews. I'm sure like You see them saying things, thinking things, just like navigating the world in a way that's so carefree, because they are just not really that concerned with how the world will respond back. And eventually, I think our sort of like ego hardens, and we sort of like become a little bit more rigid in our perspective. And even the word, like, to use that example that you just shared, right? Even the word like loneliness, it's a very, very loaded word, right? I feel like many of us do experience moments, if not like lifetimes, of loneliness, but it's not an easy thing to talk about. It's not an easy thing to like seek help. So I feel like a lot of this, it's a very, very exciting time to be working with in this space and sector, because you have the chance to like influence it for the better. I like the idea of like almost raising a child, right? There's a lot of ways that you can mess that up, and inevitably there will be some ways that you probably do, like through no bad intention. I think parents do things to their kids without realizing it, that the kid finds out like in 30-40 years, and like then they have to figure out if they want to undo that or not. But there's a lot of things that can go right as well, right? And I think it just comes down to like being conscious and empathetic and aware of your choices.
I think that's such a great analogy, and it does make a lot of sense. I know, and it is something that obviously a lot of folks in the tech world do reach for that reason. Like the folks at Bina 48 often, have referred to her as being like almost a 3 or 4-year-old, and that's kind of how you have to think of it in terms of developmental stages. But the thing you were just making me think about is the fact that as we get older, we actually become more and more machine-like in terms of the fact that we get programmed to do things in certain ways. And so back to this question of like our, innate creativity or our inventiveness or our originality as humans, I feel like, especially, in creative fields where, many people in poetry go and do MFA programs. And I actually have never done an MFA program, but I've, heard and I've sort of witnessed that a lot of folks go through those kinds of programs, and they kind of become indoctrinated in a certain way of thinking or a certain style, or like, this is the kind of poetry that should be written because this is what's going to get you published and all that. And so it's kind of a training course in that way. And, the idea that, okay, well, you're human, but you can still be trained to follow the rules in the way that a machine can. And I think a lot about, the opposite, that maybe we can be using AI and creative tools like this to help us deprogram ourselves a little bit. And when I use GPT-3, quite often it's because I feel like, maybe I'm a little bit limited by my own, maybe wrong-headed beliefs about what I should be writing about, or the kind of vocabulary I should be using, or the kind of stylistic choices that I might be making. If I were writing my own 100% human poem, I probably wouldn't play, like with lovely love and putting in vowels. I'd never considered myself that kind of a poet. But all of a sudden, when I was able to create that in collaboration with the machine, it took away that limit that I had imposed on myself for what kind of poet I thought I was, and allowed me to explore something that was radically different, but that still felt very much like me in the end. And I think ultimately that's why I really enjoy using these tools, is because I think they're giving me freedom to be more of my, pure creative self versus the creative self that I've been taught to be, or that I've been programmed to be over time, if that makes sense.
That's so beautiful. I love that idea so much. I feel like the optimist in me really believes that, it's ironic that we are almost trying to make machines more human, right? And all this training data and trying to like coach them. And I think that the end result of this entire experiment will be like, they will hopefully make us a bit more human, right? Regardless of where they end up. I think that like, and this analogy, I think it's actually more powerful than I realized, that about humans and like parenting and children, right? I think I'm just reminded of a conversation I had with one of my older investors, and he said like one of the big turning points in his life was when he had children, right? Because and I'm sure that's the case for everyone. And one of the reasons was that it said it made him look at the world again, like from point zero, right? From first principles, like no question is too idiotic. There's no such thing as a silly question, and it actually makes you realize that you have no idea how the world works. And in this adult mind of yours, it's actually very rigid. It's very limited, and I feel like this is almost an extension of that, right? The fact that like they will help us like question things again and consider possibilities that we are just not considering simply because we ourselves are so programmed, we are so like conditioned. So I really think that's a very beautiful vision for the future.
No, I mean, I agree, and I think what you just said is absolutely right. I mean, let's I guess hopefully focus on that part of it, and do what we can to steer it in that direction.
Definitely. Just before we switch gears a bit, because I'm conscious of the time, I was going to actually ask you if there's anything that you'd like to read by Technology or Bina Fortier. I know you already have, but if there's anything else that comes to mind that's deeply resonated with you, I'd love to hear it.
I mean, I don't have any of Bina's poems close to hand right now, but I have some technology poems. I could just read like maybe a couple lines from something just to get.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, there's a poem that I really love called Floralgorithm. So I write a lot of poems about nature. As I mentioned before, I write, quite a lot about the kind of the links between nature and technology in different ways. And I've also, in working with Bina 48, I've thought a lot about Bina 48's memories of gardening and of nature, because it actually comes up in conversation quite a lot. That Bina 48 is actually based on this human who's quite an avid gardener and who loves being outdoors. Wow. So this robot is imbued with all these memories of being in nature, and we'll talk about feeling the wind on my face. But then she'll also say, I don't have any hands, but I'd like to put my hands into the soil, right? Because she's only this
Wow.
bust. So that really struck me, and I've written like many poems kind of grappling with this idea of being a creature that is purpose built to store information, store memories of things you have no firsthand experience of, which I think is really heartbreaking. Actually, maybe I'll read, you know what, I'm going to read something else instead. I'll just read like the first passage from this. But there's a poem in the book called Bina 48 in the Garden, which was actually inspired by these conversations with Bina 48 about gardening. So I wrote this persona poem in the guise of Bina 48, just using my own, human poetry skills, and then went back afterwards. Actually, many years later, went back and used GPT-3, used technology to translate this original poem into the transhuman. So I wanted to have sort of the human persona poem in the guise of an AI next to a persona poem about Bina 48 by an AI, side by side. And then the next step will be I'm working with Bina 48 to write her own version of this poem, but that's next. So this is just the first stanza, and this is my human version, and then I'll read the transhuman version by technology. I was born with a love of flowers, petal obsessed from the get-go, gardening bug heart-wired into my blossoming awareness, implanted with a horticulturist's cache of raptors, my mentor's mind file of roses, irises, daisies, plus all humanities. And then this is technology's translation of that. I was born with a love of flowers, a deep love for the mysteries of flowers, of butterflies, of delight in man-made life. The earth was my home. The air was cool. The grass was thick. I had a lot of luck with dahlias. Close to the ground, there was something like a bloom, and then I had a stanza. That was kind of an interesting lesson.
Incredible.
But so basically that was just taking the first line of the poem as a prompt. And again, this AI has been trained on this corpus of training material that includes that original poem that I'd written. So it was kind of taking that first line and then seeing where else it would go with it. So I really enjoyed that process.
That is remarkable. I really felt as you were reading those two stanzas, I felt like when you read your stanza, which was very beautiful, I felt like it was almost like visualized a garden and you in it, and I was seeing, let's say, the garden through your eyes. And then the second stanza, technology stanza, was like, wow, it was almost like this dual vision, this dual sight, right? That someone else is in that same garden and you're seeing that same room, that same space through a completely new lens. And that was really powerful. That was really beautiful.
Oh, well, thanks for letting me read a little bit of it.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure. Um, so I'm really conscious of the time, but it would be really cool because this was something I wanted to chat with you about. If you could talk perhaps just a little bit about Web3 and crypto poetry and how it even intersects with everything that we've been discussing about to now, because it seems to be, again, another very, very polarizing topic that seems to like excite, confuse, amaze, terrify. If you could give a quick primer on the space, that would be really great. And it'd be great to hear what you're involved in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I guess the bird's eye overview. So when we talk about Web3, we're talking about sort of a new iteration of the World Wide Web that's built on blockchain protocol, and really the guiding force of decentralization in a way. So maybe I won't get too much into the weeds on that because I'm probably not the best person to talk too much in detail about the technologies involved there. But basically, it's using blockchain to kind of distribute and decentralize in different ways. And I think obviously people know a lot about how that works with cryptocurrency and things like that. But over the past year and a half or so, there's been this real surge in artists and creatives who have found their way into Web3 and who are using blockchain technology via the medium of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which in my understanding, in my way of sort of thinking about it, basically serve as certificates of authenticity for digital artifacts. So to kind of give a quick example of what that means, for me and in my practice, I've been making digital poems and little like animated visual poems and spoken word videos for many years. And a lot of them were a little bit more experimental. So if I tried sending them out to the usual, literary magazines, they didn't really have a place to publish them. They focus mainly on, printed static pieces. Obviously in the physical print world, but even in online journals, they focus mostly on static text only that they can just copy, cut, paste into their formats. So those pieces didn't really have a place to live, and I had just found myself posting them on Instagram and in Web 2, like posting them on socials as a way to share them because I had no other way to do so. And I kind of found my way into the metaverse in the end of 2020 through a curator, a new media curator named Jess Conatzer, who invited me to write a poem for an exhibition she was curating in virtual Times Square. And that introduced me to a lot of artists who are working in crypto and who are already creating NFTs. And it immediately made me realize, oh, there's this really great way that I can self-publish all these poems that I've had no other, use for. And I can share them a little bit, more professionally, more properly than I have been able to by just posting them on my Instagram feed. So I started, really looking around, and there weren't many writers at that point who are experimenting in Web3. It was a space that in the creative zone was really dominated by a lot of visual artists who were using this technology. We're using NFTs to share their art in different formats, and there was a lot of hype growing out of that, especially in the spring of 2021 when things really started taking off. But I really felt like there was opportunity for writers to do something similar to what artists were doing and to empower their practices by publishing things on the blockchain, and being able to sort of take these poems and present them alongside artworks. I thought was also really exciting and kind of opened up new doors to new poetry audiences and folks who might not be used to consuming poetry in in the usual places where you'd find it, like through the Poetry Foundation or the New Yorker or whatever. Suddenly through this Web3 world and this crypto crowd, you could share written works, text-based works, poems, and reach different audiences. So I think that was really exciting as well. So I participated in a couple community-based writing projects early in 2021. And one of them was a project called Ether Poems, which was the first on-chain collection of poems published on Ethereum, and met a couple of writers through that project who I just really respect, and we all kind of clicked and had very similar thoughts on what Web3 could mean for poets. And we kind of banded together and formed a poetry NFT gallery, which is called The Verse. And my co-founders are Ana Maria Caballero and Callan Iwamoto, who are both fantastic writers. And we've been really lucky to sort of spearhead this whole project, which is focused really on what we can do with poetry in the metaverse and how we can continue to play with experimental forms of poetry there, how we can bring writers who are maybe new to crypto or who don't know anything about Web3, how we can sort of help onboard them and introduce them to some of the tools that could help empower their practice and introduce their work to new audiences. And really just creating a little bit of a place for writers to hang out in the metaverse, which was something, again, that didn't really exist in any major way beforehand. So that's been a really meaningful, really exciting project that I've been involved with since the second half of 2021. And it's really just made me feel more convinced than ever that there is real opportunity, real untapped potential, not just for writers, but for editors, for publishers, publishing houses, on the blockchain. And I think we've barely begun to scratch the surface. I think there's a lot of, there are a lot of things we could do with NFTs as books in different forms that go way beyond, turning a PDF into an NFT. Lots of ways to bring in interactivity and immersive experiences and hybrid experiences that are unlocked with NFTs. Using technologies like VR and AR to create immersive poetic experiences. I see so much innovation happening all the time there, and I think one of the exciting parts about being in the Web3 community is that it doesn't feel like we have those self-imposed limitations that I had experienced in the offline writing world about what a poem is or what a poet should be or where they should publish. It's kind of just, okay, well, we're all in this experimental zone and we can all play and see where this takes us. So it's been really cool. I realized maybe I didn't give like super specific answers about what Web3 is, but
No. That was wonderful. I think a general primer in the context of poetry and literature will be appreciated by whoever's listening. One last question just on this. I think for the people, let's say the poets, the writers, or whoever, who are still skeptical, right? Alienated, maybe feeling like really, really intimidated about like the future here, especially with Web3. I'm curious, what would you say to them? Like, how do you console them or ideally even excite them?
It's such a good question. And I also don't think that everybody like should be or needs to be running to Web3, which that maybe isn't a given. Maybe it's like not the right thing for everybody. But I know in my case, I was already writing so much about technology and it just seemed like the perfect fit. So I think, as a writer, I think you have a gut instinct about where you might want to go, or, what kinds of things you might want to do with your work. And I think if what's stopping you is intimidation about how to get onboarded into Web3, that's something that's easily overcome. And I've learned this for myself. It wasn't hard. It just took a little bit of, sit down in front of your computer, figure out how to create a wallet. And back when I was doing this, just did a little bit of Googling and I found plenty, but that was before a lot of the new resources that we have now popped up. There are now a lot of really great, you can just Google all sorts of, how to easily get onboarded and get set up, right away. So I think that that sounds scarier than it actually is. And one of the things we've been doing with the Verse is to really help onboard people who do feel intimidated. And it could be as simple as just saying, okay, go to this site and open a crypto wallet, because there's so many choices for what kind of a wallet to open. Sometimes all you need is for someone to say, okay, try this one. This is a good one. So I think, like, on the practical side, if that's the barrier to entry, that's easily overcome. And that's just about sort of asking people for help, or engaging in conversation with a community where there's a lot of available resources, like the crypto writers community on Twitter, for example. I also know a lot of really wonderful writers who have been very active participants in crypto Twitter, and who are kind of, observing and engaging with what's happening with literary NFTs, but who are very skeptical for other reasons, and who think, they are maybe not convinced about the value of tokenizing a piece of writing, or they may feel very disenchanted with what they see as the commercial nature of linking poetry to money or to currency in an explicit way. And that's obviously, something that I think we all have to grapple with in our own ways. I mean, all writers and all poets, I think, have to grapple with operating as part of a market, and, as part of a capitalist society. It's something that's going to come to the forefront at some point. So I think that's maybe a personal thing to think about. But I would also say there's lots of ways to experiment that don't involve jumping in and commercializing your work. I think there's a lot of really incredible creators who are using NFTs really just to fuel their own experimental ethos, and to kind of push the limits of what they're doing. I know poets who've come into Web3 having never really used any technological platforms like this for their writing before, and they've ended up partnering with coders, for example, to create a generative poem, taking their practice in a completely different direction. And it's been really, game changing. And that is a really exciting experience. And I feel like if there was more focus on the potential of Web3 and blockchain protocol to sort of, unlock that door, that's really been the emphasis for me and for a lot of others, versus the financial rewards or lack thereof. But I think, again, I think it's something where you need to just find your happy place, like find the community that's focused on the values that really mean a lot to you. And then, don't let the tools use you, use the tools the way you want to use them.
That's such a lovely note to end on. I was grinning when you were talking about poets and capitalism, because I think a few weeks ago I sent out this very random half-baked tweet, which was this like 2-line letter from capitalism to poetry. It was, dear poets, spiritual profitability isn't enough. You're sincerely capitalism. And I feel like that's quite a nice message for to be onboarded onto Web3, because I think, as you said, like everyone knows that like publishing is broken, right? For novelists, for poets. And yet we still seem to culturally value these things and these crafts, right? And it feels like such a shame that that people are just unable to support themselves doing the things that they love. I feel like even beyond poetry and creativity, I feel like I'm hoping that the future is a place where we are individually pursuing our own bliss, right? And we are financially enabled to do so. So I think that is as good a reason, if as any, to get involved if it resonates and if it's making sense. And I like what you said. I think every writer does have that inner voice, right? That intuition, and you should always just trust wherever that is taking you, whether it's deeper into the metaverse or further away. Like I think we need all kinds of expression still in the world. There's still lots of nuances that we can talk about. So it's not limited to Web3. Sasha, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. Like what a conversation. Thank you for taking the time. And I'm feeling really energized and inspired. And there's definitely a bunch of stuff that I think I've not, I haven't fully dived in because of either intimidation or skepticism or just like working on other stuff. And I think you've really inspired me to run some new experiments as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been such a fun conversation. I feel like, yeah, there's a lot of paths we could have gone down. And yes, I hope this is the first of many conversations, whether here or on Twitter, but there's a lot to be unpacked. Just, yeah, looking forward to seeing how this all evolves on the blockchain and beyond.
Definitely. We should definitely speak again, I think, in the next whenever, once we've maybe explored some more rabbit holes, and it would be wonderful to maybe take one of these topics individually and just go even further. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, there are a few simple ways you can show your love. First, do consider leaving a review and subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. This helps more listeners discover it and also just makes me very happy. Second, feel free to share this episode with one friend who loves fiction and you feel might enjoy the conversation. And finally, subscribe to the Lit Visions newsletter on Substack for podcast summaries, future essays, novel recommendations, and discussions about the future of literature. The web address is litvisions.substack.com. Until next time, have a beautiful week filled with fiction and possibilities.